The Second English Civil War was the second of three wars known collectively as the English Civil War, which refers to the series of armed conflicts and political machinations which took place between Parliamentarians and Royalists from 1642 until 1651, and also include the First English Civil War and the Third English Civil War. Prelude. The end of the First Civil War, in 1646, left a partial power vacuum in which any combination of the three English factions, Royalists, Independents of the New Model Army, and Presbyterians of the English Parliament, as well as the Scottish Parliament allied with the Scottish Presbyterians, could prove strong enough to dominate the rest. Armed political royalism was at an end, but despite being a prisoner, King Charles I was considered by himself and his opponents as necessary to ensure the success of whichever group could come to terms with him. Thus he passed successively into the hands of the Scots, the Parliament and the army. The king attempted to reverse the verdict of arms by coquetting with each in turn. On 3 June 1647, Cornet George Joyce of Thomas Fairfax's horse seized the king for the army, after which the English Presbyterians and the Scots began to prepare for a fresh civil war, less than 2 years after the conclusion of the first, this time against independency, as embodied in the army. After making use of the army's sword, its opponents attempted to disband it, to send it on foreign service and to cut off its arrears of pay. The result was that the army leadership was exasperated beyond control, and, remembering not merely their grievances but also the principle for which the army had fought, it soon became the most powerful political force in the realm. From 1646 to 1648, the breach between army and parliament widened day by day until finally the Presbyterian party, combined with the Scots and the remaining Royalists, felt itself strong enough to begin a second civil war. Revolt against Parliament in South Wales. In February 1648, Colonel John Poyer, the parliamentary governor of Pembroke Castle, refused to hand over his command to one of Fairfax's officers, and he was soon joined by some hundreds of officers and men, who mutinied, ostensibly for arrears of pay, but really with political objectives. At the end of March, encouraged by minor successes, Poyer openly declared for the king. Disbanded soldiers continued to join him in April. All South Wales revolted, and eventually he was joined by Major General Roland Larne, his district commander, and Colonel Rice Powell. In April also news came that the Scots were arming and that Berwick and Carlisle had been seized by the English Royalists. Oliver Cromwell was at once sent off at the head of a strong detachment to deal with Larne and Poyer. But before he arrived, Larne had been severely defeated on the 8th of May by Colonel Thomas Houghton at the Battle of St. Fagans. The English Presbyterians found it difficult to reconcile their principles with their allies when it appeared that the prisoners taken at St. Fagans bore "We long to see our king" on their hats. Very soon, in fact, the English war became almost purely a royalist revolt, and the war in the north an attempt to enforce a mixture of royalism and Presbyterianism on Englishmen by means of a Scottish army. The former were disturbers of the peace and no more. Nearly all the Royalists who had fought in the First Civil War had given the parole not to bear arms against the Parliament, and many honourable Royalists, foremost amongst them the old Lord Astley, who had fought the last battle for the king in 1646, refused to break their word by taking any part in the Second War. Those who did so, and by implication those who abetted them in doing so, were likely to be treated with the utmost brutality if captured, for the army was in a less placable mood in 1648 than in 1645, and had already determined to call Charles Stuart, that man of blood, to an account for the blood he had shed. Revolt against Parliament in Kent. A precursor to Kent's Second Civil War had come on Wednesday, the 22nd of December 1647, when Canterbury's town crier had proclaimed the county committee's order for the suppression of Christmas Day in its treatment as any other working day. However, a large crowd gathered on Christmas to demand a church service, decorate doorways with holly bushes, and keep the shops shut. This crowd, under the slogan, "For God, King Charles, and Kent," then descended into violence and riot, with a soldier being assaulted, the mayor's house attacked, and the city under the rioters' control for several weeks until forced to surrender in early January. On the 21st of May 1648, Kent rose in revolt in the king's name, and a few days later a most serious blow to the independence was struck by the defection of the navy, from command of which they had removed Vice Admiral William Batten, as being a Presbyterian, though a former Lord High Admiral, the Earl of Warwick, also a Presbyterian, was brought back to the service. It was not long before the Navy made a purely royalist declaration and placed itself under the command of the Prince of Wales. But Fairfax had a clearer view and a clearer purpose than the distracted Parliament. He moved quickly into Kent, and on the evening of the 1st of June, stormed Maidstone by open force, after which the local levies dispersed to their homes, and the more determined Royalists, after a futile attempt to induce the City of London to declare for them, fled into Essex, the Downs. Before leaving for Essex, Fairfax delegated command of the Parliamentarian forces to Colonel Nathaniel Rich to deal with the remnants of the Kentish revolt in the east of the county, where the naval vessels in the Downs had gone over to the Royalists, and Royalist forces had taken control of the three previously Parliamentarian castles of the Downs, and were trying to take control of Dover Castle. Rich arrived at Dover on the 5th of June 1648 and prevented the attempt, before moving to the Downs. He took almost a month to retake Walmouth before moving on to Deal and Sandown castles. Even then, due to the small size of Rich's force, he was unable to surround both Sandown and Deal at once, and the two garrisons were able to send help to each other. At Deal he was also under bombardment from the Royalist warships, which had arrived on the 15th of July but been prevented from landing reinforcements. On the 16th, 30 Flemish ships arrived with about 1,500 mercenaries in, though the ships soon left when the Royalists ran out of money to pay them. This incited sufficient Kentish fear of foreign invasion to allow Sir Michael Livesey to raise a large enough force to come to Colonel Rich's aid. On the 28th of July, the Royalist warships returned and, after 3 weeks of failed attempts to land a relief force at Deal, on the night of the 13th of August managed to land 800 soldiers and sailors under cover of darkness. This force might have been able to surprise the besieging Parliamentarian force from the rear had it not been for a Royalist deserter who alerted the besiegers in time to defeat the Royalists, with less than 100 of them managing to get back to the ships. Another attempt at landing soon afterwards also failed, and when on the 23rd of August news was fired into Deal Castle on an arrow of Cromwell's victory at Preston, most Royalist hope was lost, and 2 days later Deal's garrison surrendered, followed by Sandown on the 5th of September. This finally ended the Kentish rebellion. Rich was made captain of Deal Castle, a position he held until 1653 and in which he spent around £500 on repairs. Revolt elsewhere. In Cornwall, Northamptonshire, North Wales, and Lincolnshire the revolt collapsed as easily as that in Kent. Only in South Wales, Essex, and the north of England was there serious fighting. In the first of these districts, South Wales, Cromwell rapidly reduced all the fortresses except Pembroke. Here Larne, Poyer, and Powell held out with the desperate courage of deserters. In the north, Pontefract Castle was surprised by the Royalists, and shortly afterwards Scarborough Castle declared for the king as well. Fairfax, after his success at Maidstone and the pacification of Kent, turned northward to reduce Essex, where, under their ardent, experienced and popular leader Sir Charles Lucas. The Royalists were in arms in great numbers. Fairfax soon drove Lucas into Colchester, but the first attack on the town was repulsed and he had to settle down to a long and wearisome siege. A Surrey rising is remembered for the death of the young and gallant Lord Francis Villiers, younger brother of George Villiers, 2nd Duke of Buckingham, in a skirmish at Kingston. The rising collapsed almost as soon as it had gathered force, and its leaders, the Duke of Buckingham and Henry Rich, the Earl of Holland, escaped. After another attempt to induce London to declare for them, to St Albans and St Neots, where Holland was taken prisoner, Buckingham escaped overseas. Lambert in the north. Major General John Lambert, a brilliant young parliamentarian commander of 29, was more than equal to the situation. He left the sieges of Pontefract Castle and Scarborough Castle to Colonel Edward Rossiter, and hurried into Cumberland to deal with the English Royalists under Sir Marmaduke Langdale. With his cavalry, Lambert got into touch with the enemy about Carlisle and slowly fell back to Bowes and Barnard Castle. Lambert fought small rearguard actions to annoy the enemy and gain time. Langdale did not follow him into the mountains. Instead, he occupied himself in gathering recruits, supplies of material, and food for the advancing Scots. Lambert, reinforced from the Midlands, reappeared early in June and drove Langdale back to Carlisle with his work half finished. About the same time, the local horse of Durham and Northumberland were put into the field for the Parliamentarians by Sir Arthur Hazelrigg, Governor of Newcastle. On the 30th of June, under the direct command of Colonel Robert Lilburne, these mounted forces won a considerable success at the River Coquette. This reverse, coupled with the existence of Langdale's Royalist force on the Cumberland side, practically compelled Hamilton to choose the west coast route for his advance. His Scottish Engager army began slowly to move down the long couloir between the mountains and the sea. The campaign of Preston, which followed, is one of the most brilliant in English history. Campaign of Preston. On the 8th of July 1648, when the Scottish Engager army crossed the border in support of the English Royalists, the military situation was well defined. For the Parliamentarians, Cromwell besieged Pembroke in South Wales, Fairfax besieged Colchester in Essex, and Colonel Rossiter besieged Pontefract and Scarborough in the north. On the 11th of July, Pembroke fell and Colchester followed on the 28th of August. Elsewhere the rebellion, which had been put down by rapidity of action rather than sheer weight of numbers, smouldered, and Charles, the Prince of Wales, with the fleet cruised along the Essex coast. Cromwell and Lambert, however, understood each other perfectly, while the Scottish commanders quarrelled with each other and with Langdale. As the English uprisings were close to collapse, it was on the adventures of the Engager Scottish army that the interest of the war centred. It was by no means the veteran army of the Earl of Leven, which had long been disbanded. For the most part it consisted of raw levies as the Kirk party had refused to sanction the engagement. David Leslie and thousands of experienced officers and men declined to serve. The leadership of James Hamilton, the Duke of Hamilton, proved to be a poor substitute for that of Leslie. Hamilton's army, too, was so ill provided that as soon as England was invaded it began to plunder the countryside for the bare means of sustenance. On the 8th of July 1648, the Scots, with Langdale as advanced guard, were about Carlisle, and reinforcements from Ulster were expected daily. Lambert's horse were at Penrith, Hexham and Newcastle, too weak to fight and having only skillful leading and rapidity of movement to enable them to gain time. Appleby Castle surrendered to the Scots on the 31st of July, whereat Lambert, who was still hanging on to the flank of the Scottish advance, fell back from Barnard Castle to Richmond so as to close Wensleydale against any attempt of the invaders to march on Pontefract. All the restless energy of Langdale's horse was unable to dislodge Lambert from the passes or to find out what was behind that impenetrable cavalry screen. The crisis was now at hand. Cromwell had received the surrender of Pembroke Castle on the 11th of July, and had marched off with his men unpaid, ragged and shoeless, at full speed through the Midlands. Rains and storms delayed his march, but he knew that the Duke of Hamilton in the broken ground of Westmoreland was still worse off. Shoes from Northampton and stockings from Coventry met him at Nottingham, and gathering up the local levies as he went, he made for Doncaster, where he arrived on the 8th of August, having gained 6 days in advance of the time he had allowed himself for the march. He then called up artillery from Hull, exchanged his local levies for the regulars who were besieging Pontefract, and set off to meet Lambert. On the 12th of August he was at Wetherby, Lambert with horse and foot at Otley, Langdale at Skipton and Gargrave, Hamilton at Lancaster, and Sir George Monro with the Scots from Ulster and the Carlisle Royalists at Hornby. On the 13th of August, while Cromwell was marching to join Lambert at Otley, the Scottish leaders were still disputing whether they should make for Pontefract or continue through Lancashire so as to join Lord Byron and the Cheshire Royalists. Battle of Preston on the 14th of August 1648. Cromwell and Lambert were at Skipton, on the 15th of August at Gisburn, and on the 16th of August they marched down the valley of the Ribble towards Preston with full knowledge of the enemy's dispositions and full determination to attack him. They had with them horse and foot not only of the army, but also of the militia of Yorkshire, Durham, Northumberland and Lancashire, and were heavily outnumbered, having only 8,600 men against perhaps 20,000 of Hamilton's command. But the latter were scattered for convenience of supply along the road from Lancaster, through Preston, towards Wigan, Langdale's corps having thus become the left flank guard instead of the advanced guard. Langdale called in his advanced parties, perhaps with a view to resuming the duties of advanced guard, on the night of the 13th of August, and collected them near Long Ridge. It is not clear whether he reported Cromwell's advance, but, if he did, Hamilton ignored the report, for on the 17th of August Monro was half a day's march to the north, Langdale east of Preston, and the main army strung out on the Wigan road. Major General William Bailey with a body of foot, the rear of the column, being still in Preston. Hamilton, yielding to the importunity of his Lieutenant General, James Livingston, 1st Earl of Callendar, sent Bailey across the Ribble to follow the main body just as Langdale, with 3,000 foot and 500 horse only, met the first shock of Cromwell's attack on Preston Moor. Hamilton, like Charles at Edgehill, passively shared in, without directing, the Battle of Preston, and, though Langdale's men fought fiercely, they were driven to the Ribble after 4 hours' struggle. Bailey attempted to cover the Ribble and Darwin bridges on the Wigan road, but Cromwell had forced his way across both before nightfall. Pursuit was at once undertaken, and not relaxed until Hamilton had been driven through Wigan and Winwick to Uttoxeter and Ashbourne. There, pressed furiously in rear by Cromwell's horse and held up in front by the militia of the Midlands, the remnant of the Scottish army laid down its arms on the 25th of August. Various attempts were made to raise the Royalist standard in Wales and elsewhere, but Preston was the death blow. On the 28th of August, starving and hopeless of relief, the Colchester Royalists surrendered to Lord Fairfax. Execution of Charles I. The victors in the Second Civil War were not merciful to those who had brought war into the land again. On the evening of the surrender of Colchester, Sir Charles Lucas and Sir George Lisle were shot. Larne, Poyer and Powell were sentenced to death, but Poyer alone was executed on the 25th of April 1649, being the victim selected by lot. Of 5 prominent Royalist peers who had fallen into the hands of Parliament, 3, the Duke of Hamilton, the Earl of Holland, and Lord Capel, one of the Colchester prisoners and a man of high character, were beheaded at Westminster on the 9th of March. Above all, after long hesitations, even after renewal of negotiations, The army and the independents conducted a prize purge of the house, removing their ill wishes, and created a court for the trial and sentence of King Charles I. At the end of the trial, the 59 commissioners found Charles I guilty of high treason, as of tyrant, traitor, murderer and public enemy. He was beheaded on a scaffold in front of the banqueting house of the Palace of Whitehall on 30 January 1649. Pontefract Castle. Pontefract Castle was noted by Oliver Cromwell as one of the strongest inland garrisons in the kingdom. Even in ruins, the castle held out in the north for the Royalists. Upon the execution of Charles I, the garrison recognized Charles II as king and refused to surrender. On 24 March 1649, almost 2 months after Charles was beheaded, the garrison of the last Royalist stronghold finally capitulated. Parliament had the remains of the castle demolished the same year.